I've noticed that sports card collectors in the US quite often don't really consider the international nature of the hobby when they speculate on the future of the hobby, the future of card values, or what kinds of cards may see the most growth into the future. In this video, we're going to reflect on a few areas where I think the growth of the sports card hobby internationally is and will continue to affect the hobby at large. Number 1. Sports with a more international fan base have more potential for sports card growth internationally. Over the past decade or so, the sports card hobby has been taking deeper roots in a number of places. Back in 2021, eBay put out a report that said that card sales on its platform from countries outside the US had grown by 162% from a year earlier. Australia had a 379% increase over that previous year, China a 205% increase, Canada a 149% increase, and Europe a 113% increase. In addition, they also highlighted that the two sports that had seen the highest growth in that same time period were soccer at an insane 1,586% and basketball at 373%. Now I know this was a report released during the heart of the sports card values spike, so all of the data and stats taken during that time do have a variety of unusual variables to keep in mind, but I think there is still something in those numbers that is really telling. Australia and China clearly have massively growing sports card markets. Canada and Europe as well have growing sports card markets, and I've heard from some other international collectors about hobby hotspots popping up here and there in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and who knows where else. Now there's a couple of things that hold true in most of these places. Soccer is massively popular, and to quite a large degree as well, the NBA is massively popular. Soccer is the most popular sport worldwide, and basketball as well is an incredibly internationally popular sport with large fan bases just about everywhere. The fact that eBay saw growth in those two sports seems very likely connected to their international popularity in many ways. If the hobby continues to grow in countries around the world, it only makes sense to me that soccer and basketball would be core to that process. I was talking to a collector who lives in Japan, and even there, where baseball is massively popular, he said that really basketball is the most popular sport for cards. In China, at the moment I'm writing this script here right now, there's 40,526 basketball cards up for auction right now on Card Hobby. There's 19,178 soccer cards, 477 baseball cards, 371 American football cards, and 540 UFC cards, and 4 hockey cards. That means basketball is like 2/3 of the entire domestic sports card market in China, and soccer is about the other third, and all the other sports basically fit into like the margin of error. Even UFC has more than baseball or American football. Baseball and American football are both massively popular in the US, but outside of the US, it's really niche pockets of fans here and there. It's far from mainstream. So if sports card continued to grow internationally, it makes sense that American football and baseball would still mostly be US based. I would suggest that this might mean that as far as how macroeconomic factors affect the value of cards, it could end up being different in different sports. Baseball and American football will likely always be very connected to the economic factors of the US economy specifically, whereas basketball and soccer could eventually be also very informed by the economic factors happening in other countries in a deeper way. I think it's limited right now in that regard, but if sports cards grow bigger and bigger in other places, I think those countries will eventually have a bigger impact on the values of cards, even in the US market in basketball and soccer specifically. Number 2. If a country's domestic sports card ecosystem develops strong enough to be largely independent from other markets, it's going to become important to better understand macroeconomic factors beyond the US-centric factors that are currently most often considered when US-based hobbyists consider macroeconomic factors. It's a long title. When I hear sports card hobbyists reflect on macroeconomic factors in relation to their effect on sports card values today, it's almost always in relation to the conditions of the US economy specifically. And while the world's economies are interconnected in quite a many ways, they are all on their unique paths. Up to this point, a hobbyist honestly hasn't had to reflect much beyond the borders of the US when considering macroeconomic factors. But if the sports card hobby continues to become more global, that will need to change. For the present moment, I think China may be the only place that has a domestic sports card ecosystem that operates almost independently from the rest of the world. But even just within that one quote-unquote case study, it is possible to see how market value differentiates between eBay prices and prices within the Chinese domestic market quite often. There are factors that influence supply and demand within that domestic market differently than they do on eBay, which I'd say is the main international market space. Now, it's not that China is separate from the international market completely. Individuals in China can still engage with the international sports card market, but it's much harder to do than it is to just engage with the domestic sports card market. I mean, then you avoid international shipping, you avoid potential border issues, you avoid potential language barriers, you avoid all kinds of stuff. And since the domestic market is quite strong, there isn't a lot of incentive for the average Chinese sports card hobbyist to really engage with eBay or the rest of the international sports card market in any real deep way. They've got a perfectly suitable domestic space to interact within. Some still do interact on eBay, but they don't have to. At the present moment, China may be the only place other than the US where the domestic sports card market is strong enough to support itself independently. But in the future, will that always be the case? For example, if the hobby took deeper root in Europe, could Europe end up developing an ecosystem that could operate independently? What about Australia? What about East Asia, like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, etc.? Could those places eventually develop an ecosystem that operates somewhat separately from the US sports card market as well? If that did happen, I think it could mean some interesting things. For example, when the sports card market saw its crazy value spikes in 2020 and 2021, while there were some value spikes in the Chinese domestic market, they did not see the kind of spikes that were happening in the US at that time. And while the value of cards has been generally decreasing overall during the past few months in the US and on eBay and such, the value of cards on the Chinese domestic market has been staying relatively the same, again, at least to my observations. The Chinese domestic sports card values and the international market sports card values don't always follow the exact same patterns. There are some different macroeconomic factors that sometimes influence those values in different ways. If different places also ended up developing strong internal sports card ecosystems, I could see how it could affect a number of things. For example, if China had its own strong domestic sports card ecosystem, and so did Europe, and so did a block of countries in East Asia, and so did Australia, and maybe eventually some other countries enter the game, then if something like an economic recession hit the US economy, I could see the value of cards in sports like basketball and soccer, very international sports, not being affected nearly as much as baseball and American football, sports that are not completely but almost exclusive to the US. Number 3, keeping an eye on the going price for different products abroad could end up being important to gauging value in the US market as well. Now, I made a video a long time ago, back near the time I was first starting this channel, in which I reflected on how interesting it was to me how much cheaper I could find Crown Royale basketball cards for in China than I could in the US, both for sealed wax and for single cards. With the most recent releases in 21-22, I've noticed the same sort of thing with Court Kings and Revolution basketball. I've been buying up some Revolution like Astros, Fractals, etc., and some Court Kings like some Acetate and the Rookies level 1 and 2 of Cade, Mobley, and Barnes for crazy low prices. Low enough that even if those cards' values just keep dropping steeply and consistently for another year on eBay, and I still hadn't been able to sell them yet for whatever reason, I'd still likely be in a position to still make some profit on them even at that point. But over time, I think this kind of value difference affects the value of cards on the US domestic market. Crown Royale single cards on the open market in the US over the past few years, to my view at least, often seem quite undervalued compared to how much it costs to open a box of that product. And I think that part of that might have to do with the fact that those same Crown Royale cards can be quite a lot cheaper on the Chinese domestic market. And since the Chinese domestic market is relatively large, I think it can over time pull the values down a bit on the US market as well. I might be wrong, but this is what it seems possible to me. Over time, if the sports card markets in other countries also strengthen, I could see how this could become even more common. A sports card distributor in, say, the Philippines, for example, might need to, and be perfectly happy to, keep their profit margins lower than a distributor might need to do in the US or elsewhere where the cost of living is higher and they'd need higher profit margins to keep their distribution business afloat. The smaller profit margin in the Philippines might be perfectly reasonable for that local distributor there, based on the conditions of the local economy. If something like that became common in a number of different places, I could see how it could end up affecting the value of the cards from those products on the market at large. What other things do you think about when you think about the effects that a growing international sports card market could have in the hobby? Let us know in the comments below. And again, I could be wrong about all of this stuff. I say that a lot in these videos. This is just how I'm reflecting on all of this.